Welcome to our deep dive into Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States.
Ooh, this one is a classic.
It is, and this book really kind of shakes things up,
Hmm.
challenging those traditional American history narratives and giving a voice to the groups we don't always hear from.
It's a different perspective for sure.
I'm excited to see what hidden truths we uncover.
Me too.
So Zinn's work really is all about, showing how history is shaped by everyday people.
Yeah, and especially by those who have been pushed to the margins.
Right.
He wants us to see those conflicts, the injustices, and that resistance that often gets left out of the usual textbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do we even begin with a book like this?
Well, I think Zinn starts by taking us all the way back,
Come on.
back to the arrival of Europeans and their impact on native populations.
Hmm.
And it's such a stark contrast to those heroic stories we often hear.
Right, like those romanticized tales of exploration and discovery.
Exactly.
Yeah, Zinn definitely doesn't hold back.
Yeah, he does not.
He uses the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know much about him?
I do. He was a Spanish priest who saw firsthand the horrific treatment of Native Americans by those conquistadors.
Right.
So Las Casas gives us a chilling account of the devastation.
Yeah?
Driven by greed and a hunger for power, the Spaniards engaged in widespread violence, enslavement, and death.
Yeah, it's a perspective that you definitely do not get in those traditional accounts.
Right.
Zinn even quotes Las Casas describing the Spaniards as exasperating, ravaging, killing, mangling, and destroying.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he follows that up by challenging readers, asking how anyone could believe the traditional narratives that just brush over such brutality.
It's hard to reconcile those two perspectives, for sure.
It is. And of course, there's that whole issue of celebrating Columbus Day
Right.
without really acknowledging the dark side of what happened.
It's a prime example of how we can sometimes celebrate a historical figure without fully grasping the impact of their actions.
Right, it's like focusing on the discovery.
Yes.
While overlooking the cost to the people who were already here.
Exactly.
Zinn doesn't stop with Columbus.
No, he doesn't.
He shares this really chilling story about Richard Grenville, an English explorer who landed in Virginia.
Oh, yeah. What was that one again?
He encounters these Native Americans who are initially quite welcoming,
Okay.
but when one of them takes a silver cup,
Uh-oh.
Grenville retaliates by burning down their entire village.
Oh, wow.
It's a disturbing act that really sets the tone for a lot of the future interactions between Europeans and Native Americans.
It really does make you realize that that pattern of violence and mistreatment was established very early on, even before permanent settlements took root.
Yeah. And then there's that famous exchange between Powhatan,
Oh, yeah.
the leader of an Indian confederacy, and John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown colony.
I remember that one.
It's almost prophetic.
It is.
Powhatan saw the writing on the wall. He understood the danger posed by the English settlers, and he tried to warn Smith, asking, "Why will you take by force what you may have quietly by love? Why will you destroy us who supply you with food?"
Yeah. He really understood those power dynamics at play
He did.
and his warnings about the consequences of exploitation.
But sadly, those warnings were ignored as the English continued to encroach on Native American lands.
Yeah, this really sets the stage for a lot of the tension and conflict that continues throughout American history.
It does. And that sense of exploitation really comes through in Zinn's exploration of slavery.
Right.
He dives into those early years in Virginia and the factors that led to the use of enslaved Africans. So the Virginia colonists were struggling to survive. They desperately needed labor to grow enough food.
Right.
And they turned to the transatlantic slave trade, which was already a well-established system by that point.
It's hard to imagine the desperation those early colonists must have felt.
Zinn actually talks about the starving time, where they were so desperate for food that they resorted to eating corpses.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And they even targeted Native Americans for food, going so far as to dig up graves.
Wow.
It's a grim reminder of how their sense of superiority clashed with their inability to thrive in this new environment.
And as historian Edmund Morgan points out, that clash likely contributed to their willingness to exploit others.
It's disturbing how quickly the idea of enslaving Africans seemed to take hold. By 1619, ships were arriving with enslaved Africans, and a system of forced labor was being put in place.
It was a brutal system.
It was. Imagine being captured, forced to march hundreds of miles to the coast, and then packed onto a ship in horrific conditions.
Oh, God.
Chained together in cramped, unsanitary spaces. The psychological and physical trauma inflicted on these individuals is difficult to comprehend.
It really is. Zinn uses powerful imagery to bring those horrors to life.
He does. He describes the slave ships, the darkness, the stench, the cries of those suffering. He even quotes a description of the cages used to hold Africans on the Gold Coast. Blacks were crammed in with so little space that they could only lie down on their sides.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to the way we often think about history.
It is.
It's easy to focus on those dates and battles, but Zinn forces us to confront the human cost of these events.
Right.
The suffering of individuals caught in the machinery of history.
And he makes it clear that this wasn't just about hard labor.
No.
This was about creating a system where one group of people was considered property to be bought and sold at will.
And that distinction between enslaved Africans and white indentured servants was crucial.
It was. White indentured servants had a term of service.
Right.
They could eventually earn their freedom.
But enslaved Africans were trapped in a system with no legal rights,
Right.
no escape from their status as property.
And that really laid the groundwork for centuries of racial inequality.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is how Zinn shows that the Virginia elite understood the potential threat of a united working class.
Oh, interesting.
They realized that poor whites and enslaved blacks sharing similar hardships
Right.
could potentially rebel together.
That's where policies aimed at dividing these groups came into play.
Exactly. He points to Bacon's rebellion as a turning point.
Okay.
This revolt, led by Nathaniel Bacon, actually drew support from both white indentured servants and enslaved Africans.
Oh, wow.
And this scared the ruling class.
Of course.
It revealed the potential power of a united front.
So the rebellion was ultimately crushed.
It was.
But that fear of that unity lingered.
Right. The ruling class responded by enacting laws that granted certain benefits to white indentured servants.
Okay. Like what?
Things like land and tools upon completion of their service.
Interesting.
But these benefits were intentionally withheld from enslaved Africans,
Wow.
creating a wedge between the two groups.
So they were playing both sides.
Yes. This strategy effectively aligned the interests of poor whites with the ruling class, further entrenching racial divisions in the colony.
It's a chilling example of how those in power can manipulate systems to maintain control.
It is. They understood that a divided working class was easier to control than a united one.
And we see the consequences of this strategy play out throughout American history, don't we?
We do. Those racial divisions continue to be exploited even today.
It's one of the things that makes Zinn's work so unsettling.
And I think so important.
It is.
It's not just a history lesson. It's a challenge to look at the systems and structures that continue to shape our world.
So from those early encounters with Native Americans to the establishment of a system built on slavery, Zinn paints a very different picture of America's beginnings.
He does.
He's not afraid to expose those dark undercurrents that often get swept under the rug.
Yeah, and it lays the groundwork for understanding how those patterns of power and exploitation continue to influence American history.
Exactly.
And as we move into the era of the American Revolution, we'll see how those themes of power, inequality, and the struggle for freedom continue to play out, but in new and complex ways.
So we left off talking about how Zinn sets the stage for like a different understanding of American history. Now let's dive into the American Revolution. It's fascinating how he acknowledges those ideals of liberty and equality that fueled the revolution.
Right.
But he also shines a light on who was excluded from those promises.
It's like he's saying, hold on a minute. Let's look at who was actually benefiting from this fight for freedom.
Right. The Declaration of Independence famously states that all men are created equal.
Right. All men are created equal.
But Zinn is quick to point out that this equality didn't extend to everyone.
Definitely.
Women couldn't vote,
Right.
own property, or have the same opportunities as men.
Yeah.
Native Americans continued to face displacement and violence as settlers pushed westward.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, enslaved Africans remained trapped in a system that denied their basic humanity.
Yeah. Zinn argues that while some of the founding fathers might have had noble intentions,
Right.
they were also concerned with protecting their own power and privilege.
It makes you wonder, was the revolution really a fight for freedom? Or was it more about a shift in who held the reins of power?
That's a good question.
He also reminds us that there were plenty of people who weren't content with the way things were even after the revolution.
Yeah. Like who?
He talks about those uprisings like the tenant riots and Shays' Rebellion.
Right. Those were led by farmers and laborers who were struggling under debt and unfair taxes.
Exactly. They were demanding a fairer system, a system that acknowledged their struggles and provided some relief.
And then there's the story of the Continental Army's mutinies.
Right. It's not something you typically hear about in those heroic tales of the revolution.
No, it's not.
Zinn highlights how ordinary soldiers were facing incredible hardships,
Yeah.
and their protests were met with harsh suppression.
It's a stark reminder that even within the fight for independence, there were deep divisions and power struggles.
It makes you question, was the revolution truly a unified effort?
Mm.
Or were there competing interests at play, even within the ranks of those fighting for freedom?
Interesting. So this brings us to the 19th century.
Right, a period of massive change with the rise of industrialization.
Huge changes.
Zinn doesn't shy away from the darker side of this progress, does he?
No, he doesn't.
He explores those harsh realities faced by workers during this time.
It was a tough time for a lot of people. Industrialization brought advancements, but it also created a system where workers were often exploited.
Right.
Zinn talks about those brutal working conditions in factories, mines, and railroads.
Long hours, unsafe environments, meager wages.
Yeah, it was a struggle for many just to survive.
He gives us a glimpse into those lives, like the young girls working in textile factories, for almost nothing, enduring terrible conditions.
It's a reminder that progress often comes at a human cost.
And as industries grew, so did the wealth and power of a select few.
Exactly. Zinn talks about those figures like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, those titans of industry who amassed vast fortunes.
Right.
But he also highlights the impact this had on the growing disparity between the wealthy elite and the working class.
It's a theme that echoes throughout history, isn't it?
It is, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few,
Right.
while many struggle to make ends meet.
But Zinn also shows us how people fought back.
They did.
He traces the development of those early labor movements, highlighting their struggles for better wages, safer conditions, and the right to organize.
Groups like the Knights of Labor and the IWW faced incredible opposition,
They did.
not just from corporations, but also from the government.
It's interesting how Zinn shows that the legal system, especially the Supreme Court, often sided with those corporate interests.
Right. It's like he's saying that the system itself was designed to protect those in power, even if it meant upholding practices that were harmful to workers.
It reminds me of that quote by Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Powerful words.
And that brings us to the 20th century, a period marked by world wars, social movements, and the persistence of inequality.
This is where Zinn's work really starts to resonate with contemporary issues.
It does.
He tackles those global conflicts, the rise of various social movements, and that ongoing struggle for equality and justice.
Let's start with World War I. I found it fascinating how Zinn explores the complexities of America's involvement.
Oh, yeah.
He acknowledges the fight against fascism,
Right.
but doesn't let us forget about the less noble aspects of U.S. foreign policy.
He challenges that idea that America always enters wars for purely altruistic reasons.
Right.
He points out that there are often economic and political interests at play.
And he doesn't shy away from showing how those conflicts often lead to the suppression of dissent at home.
Right. He talks about the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act being used to silence critics of the war.
It's a reminder that even during times of national crisis, those in power can use those circumstances to restrict freedom of speech and target those who hold different views.
It's a scary thought.
And it wasn't just during World War I.
No.
He also discusses the Red Scare that followed the war.
Right. That period of intense anti-communist paranoia really highlights how fear and suspicion can be used to justify the persecution of individuals and groups.
It's a dark chapter in American history, and it's something that Zinn urges us to remember and learn from.
Absolutely. Then, of course, there's World War II.
Another conflict that Zinn approaches with a critical eye.
He does. He acknowledges the horrors of fascism and the need to defeat it, but he also raises questions about some of the decisions made by the U.S. government during that time.
He explores the motivations behind America's involvement,
Right.
pointing out that it wasn't always a clear-cut case of good versus evil.
Yeah, and he also highlights the impact of the war on the home front, including the internment of Japanese Americans.
It's a stark reminder that even during a fight against tyranny abroad, we can sometimes fall short of our own ideals of justice and equality at home.
Very true. And speaking of the fight for equality,
Yeah,
Zinn's exploration of the civil rights movement is incredibly powerful.
it is. He traces the movement's development from the Montgomery bus boycott to the freedom rides and the fight for voting rights.
He really captures the courage and determination of those activists, who risked everything to challenge segregation and demand equal rights.
And he highlights the strategic brilliance of their nonviolent resistance, showing how they used it to expose the brutality of the Jim Crow system.
The way he describes those attacks on freedom riders, those brutal beatings by mobs armed with bats and chains, is just horrifying.
It's hard to believe that this was happening not that long ago.
It is. And he doesn't just focus on those well-known events. He also discusses the role of organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in organizing and mobilizing people.
Right. He emphasizes how important leadership strategy and grassroots organizing were to the movement's success.
He gives us those behind-the-scenes insights into how change happens, how ordinary people can come together to challenge a deeply entrenched system.
But he also acknowledges that the civil rights movement didn't solve all the problems.
Right.
He argues that it didn't fully address the deeper issues of economic inequality and systemic racism.
Those issues continue to plague us today, don't they?
They do.
Mm.
And that's one of the reasons why Zinn's work remains so relevant. He's not just recounting history.
Right.
He's inviting us to see the connections between the past and the present.
Yes.
To understand how those historical injustices continue to shape our world today.
He reminds us that the fight for equality is an ongoing process.
It's not a destination, it's a journey.
Exactly. And as we move further into the 20th century, we see that fight for equality take on new forms. The women's movement emerges with renewed force, challenging traditional gender roles and demanding greater control over their lives and their bodies.
It's interesting how Zinn connects this movement to earlier struggles for women's rights, highlighting those pioneers like Frances Wright, who advocated for women's emancipation in the 19th century.
Right, but he also shows how the fight evolved in the 20th century, taking on new issues like reproductive rights and equal pay.
He talks about Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which really challenged those traditional notions of womanhood and helped ignite a new wave of feminism.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from those internal debates within the movement, showing how different groups of women had different priorities and perspectives.
He also highlights the contributions of women of color who faced multiple forms of oppression, reminding us that the fight for equality must always be intersectional, recognizing those overlapping systems of power and privilege.
It's about understanding the complexities of people's experiences.
And speaking of challenging power, Zinn's exploration of the anti-war movement is equally compelling.
It is. He traces its development from those early protests against World War I to the massive demonstrations against the Vietnam War.
He shows how this movement drew inspiration and tactics from the civil rights movement, using nonviolent resistance to challenge the government's war policies.
Yeah, he takes us inside those marches, those teach-ins, those acts of civil disobedience, helping us understand the passion and commitment of those who believed the war was wrong.
And he doesn't let us forget about those who resisted within the military itself.
Right, like who?
He talks about soldiers refusing orders, those acts of sabotage known as fragging, and those who chose to desert rather than fight in a war they didn't believe in.
It's a reminder that dissent can take many forms.
Right.
And that sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance come from those within the system itself.
And of course, he discusses the government's response to the anti-war movement.
Right.
Those attempts to discredit activists, to label them as unpatriotic or communist sympathizers.
It echoes those earlier periods of repression we talked about, doesn't it?
It does. Those times when fear and paranoia were used to justify silencing dissent and suppressing social movements.
Yeah. But despite those efforts, Zinn argues that the anti-war movement played a crucial role in ending the Vietnam War.
He sees it as a testament to the power of people, to challenge those in authority, to force them to listen and to change course.
It's a theme that runs through his work. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, ordinary people can make a difference.
And that brings us to another crucial theme, the struggle for economic justice. Zinn argues that this struggle has been a constant throughout American history.
What does he say about it?
He says it's about those workers, those farmers, those who have been left behind or exploited, fighting for a fairer share of the nation's wealth and a greater say in how things are run.
He connects this struggle to the rise of industrialization, the exploitation of workers, the emergence of those early labor unions fighting for better conditions.
Right. He takes us back to those violent labor battles of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, those strikes that were met with brutal repression.
Those stories are a stark reminder of the lengths those in power will go to maintain control, even if it means resorting to violence.
And he doesn't shy away from discussing the role of radicals and socialists in the labor movement, those who dared to challenge the capitalist system itself.
Interesting. Like who?
He highlights figures like Eugene Debs, a socialist leader who fought tirelessly for workers' rights.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
Debs even ran for president several times, advocating for a more equitable distribution of wealth and power.
Wow. It's a reminder that throughout American history, there have always been those who dared to imagine a different kind of society, a more just and equitable one.
Zinn also connects those earlier struggles for economic justice to the Great Depression, arguing that it exposed the inherent flaws in the capitalist system.
Right.
He then explores the emergence of the New Deal, those programs implemented by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to provide relief, recovery, and reform in response to the Depression.
He highlights the impact of programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, those initiatives that provided jobs and financial assistance to millions of Americans.
Right, it's a significant shift in government policy, recognizing a responsibility to provide a safety net for its citizens.
But Zinn also points out the limitations of the New Deal, arguing that it didn't go far enough in addressing the root causes of the Depression or challenging those fundamental power structures that contribute to inequality.
He sees those New Deal programs as a step in the right direction, but reminds us that the struggle for economic justice is a long and complex one.
And that struggle continues through the 20th century and into the 21st century. Zinn sees those later social movements, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, as all connected to that broader fight for economic justice.
He's saying that it's not just about specific issues like voting rights or equal pay.
Yeah.
It's about challenging those systems that perpetuate inequality and create conditions where some people have access to wealth and power while others are left behind.
It's a powerful message, and it's one that resonates deeply in our current times. Zinn's work encourages us to see those connections, to understand how historical injustices continue to shape our world, and to recognize our own role in fighting for a more just and equitable society.
And speaking of fighting for justice, Zinn doesn't shy away from tackling the issue of American imperialism.
Oh, this is interesting.
He argues that the quest for empire has been a driving force in American foreign policy for centuries, motivated by economic interests, strategic considerations, and a belief in American exceptionalism.
He challenges those narratives that portray American interventions abroad as purely altruistic, those stories that emphasize spreading democracy and freedom.
He argues that often those interventions are driven by a desire to secure access to resources, to protect markets, and to maintain American dominance on the global stage.
He's particularly critical of the Cold War, arguing that it wasn't just about containing Soviet expansion, but also about suppressing revolutionary movements in other countries and maintaining American control over the global economic system.
Right. He points to those interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and Latin America as examples of how the United States used its military and economic might to prop up friendly regimes and undermine those that challenged its interests.
And he also highlights the role of covert operations, those actions taken in the shadows, often hidden from public view.
He discusses the CIA's involvement in overthrowing democratically elected governments and supporting repressive regimes, those actions that contradict the image of America as a champion of freedom and democracy.
It's a stark reminder that power, even when wielded by a nation that claims to uphold noble ideals, can be used in ways that are harmful and unjust.
Zinn forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths, to see beyond the rhetoric, and to grapple with the complexities of American power.
And he reminds us that those actions have consequences. He talks about the domestic impact of American imperialism, the increased militarization, the erosion of civil liberties, the diversion of resources away from social programs.
He sees a direct link between those vast sums spent on the military and the neglect of domestic needs like education, healthcare, and poverty reduction.
It's like he's saying that the pursuit of empire comes at a cost, not just for those in other countries, but also for the American people themselves.
And he doesn't just focus on the actions of the government.
No.
He also discusses the role of corporations in shaping American foreign policy, arguing that they often have a significant influence over government decisions.
Right. He sees a close relationship between those corporate interests and those interventions and covert operations carried out by the government.
It's a reminder that power is often exercised through a complex web of relationships involving not just government officials, but also those who hold economic power.
It's important to understand those connections if we want to challenge those systems that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
So from those early colonial encounters to the complexities of American imperialism, Zinn paints a very different picture of American history.
He challenges us to see beyond those heroic narratives, to confront those uncomfortable truths, and to recognize the ongoing struggles for justice and equality that have shaped our nation. He shows us that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, it's a story of people, their struggles, their triumphs, their failures. And he reminds us that we are all part of that story, that we have a responsibility to learn from the past and to work towards a more just and equitable future.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into a people's history,
We have.
exploring those often overlooked aspects of American history.
Yeah, those hidden stories.
As we wrap up, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the book's overarching themes and its lasting impact on how we understand history and our role in shaping the future.
Well, I think Zinn's work is a powerful reminder that history is not a neutral recounting of events. It's a narrative shaped by those who hold power,
Right.
and it often reflects their interests and perspectives.
What makes Zinn's book so impactful
Mm.
is his unwavering commitment to telling history from the viewpoint of those who have often been excluded from that dominant narrative.
He consistently centers the experiences of those marginalized groups, the Native Americans, enslaved Africans, women workers, and so many others, showing how their struggles have shaped the course of American history.
It's like he's saying, hey, let's not just focus on those in power. Let's listen to the voices of those who have been silenced, those whose stories have been overlooked.
Exactly. And by doing so, he helps us understand the complexities and contradictions of American history.
Right.
Those conflicts and tensions that are often glossed over in those traditional celebratory accounts.
He reveals those deep divisions that have existed throughout the nation's past, those struggles for justice and equality that continue to this day.
They do.
Another key theme that really resonated with me is the idea that power concedes nothing without a demand. Zinn emphasizes the importance of collective action, those social movements, those acts of resistance that challenge the status quo and push for change.
He shows us countless examples of ordinary people organizing, protesting, and fighting for their rights, reminding us that change doesn't happen simply through the goodwill of those in power.
He highlights the power of those movements.
Yeah.
From those early rebellions against colonial rule to those labor movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, and so many others.
He shows how these movements, often led by those who had the least power, force those in authority to address the demands of the marginalized and oppressed.
It's a powerful message, especially for those of us who sometimes feel powerless in the face of those larger systems and structures. Zinn reminds us that even small acts of resistance can contribute to a larger movement for change.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the book's lasting impact.
Mm.
A People's History has become a classic.
It
A
has.
text that has challenged the way history is taught in schools and universities.
It sparked debate and discussion
It has.
about the meaning of American democracy, the nation's role in the world, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality.
It's inspired countless students, activists, and historians to question those narratives they've been taught and to seek out those untold stories, those perspectives that have been left out of those mainstream accounts.
It's like he's given us a new lens through which to view history, one that allows us to see those power dynamics, those struggles, those acts of resistance that are so often hidden from view.
And that's why his work remains so relevant today. It's not just about understanding the past.
Right.
It's about using that understanding to create a more just and equitable future.
He challenges us to become active participants in shaping history, to recognize our own agency in challenging those systems that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
He leaves us with a sense of hope, doesn't he?
He does.
He reminds us that even in the face of those overwhelming challenges, we have the power to make a difference.
He encourages us to learn from those who came before us, to draw inspiration from their struggles, to act with courage and compassion, and to never give up hope in the fight for a better world.
His work is a call to action, an invitation to join those ongoing struggles for justice and equality that have shaped our nation and continue to shape our world today.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into Howard Zinn's A People's History in the United States. We hope this exploration has been insightful and thought-provoking, leaving you with a deeper understanding of American history and a renewed sense of possibility for creating a more just and equitable future. Thanks for joining us.